And you can tell it's because it's not got people in the writing room that have lived experience.
I mean, I think she's also a special case in a way because she's completely deranged.
It's true. Hello and welcome back to Impolite Company. In this episode, we talk about representation and diversity and whether they're one and the same, the impact of hollow representation and the damage it can cause, the increasingly dangerous rhetoric coming out of the mouths of the most powerful people of colour in the country at the moment. And then we also talk about the representation in pop culture and how great access to diverse stories has changed over the years.
We're back. This is
Season
two. And we're a little bit out of practice, I think.
Out of sorts.
We're a bit, yeah. But we're back. I'm really excited because we're going to talk about...
We're black.
We're ready to
attack. No, we're not.
Cut that out. Don't want to scare the white people. No, but we're back and we're going to talk about a topic that I think is quite multifaceted, is quite complex, but kind of gets dulled down and flattened and simplified often when it's talked about in the media, which is the topic of representation. Representation being people, whether they're in leadership roles or in or represented in film and TV, but what are the kind of considerations? Can it ever be a bad thing? And kind of what are the differences between representation and diversity, if any? And
the impact it has if there isn't proper representation that's broad enough, and or a specific type of representation, and people seeing it as kind of monolithic.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose, how would you almost define representation to start with? What?
Yeah, that's a good question. For example, Rishi Sunak, Suella Braverman, but like
he pushed his glasses further up his nose when he said that name.
I think they represent a specific type of Southern Asian person.
Yeah.
Same with Kemi. What's her name?
Kemi Badenoch.
Yeah. I think they represent a similar type of person of colour, more so than I'd say myself or my family or my upbringing. That's more kind of like conservative leaning, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's fine. We're not monolithic, so it's okay to have diversity. I think it's important to have diversity and acknowledgement of that. When there's an unbalance of representation which doesn't represent the broadness, that's when I think it becomes an issue. I think that's what we have at the moment, where it's like the most palatable representation is what's being pushed to the top.
So are you saying the most palatable in terms of demographics, like there's certain demographics that are more palatable, or are we saying there's a palatability if you fall in line with certain viewpoints?
Yeah, so I think it's more about
the answer to that is yes.
Yeah. So I think it's that kind of, you're not like every black person. You're that kind of.
So it's a viewpoint thing.
It's a viewpoint thing, I think, and palatability though as well, right? Because it's easier for other people to feel like you're one of them if you align with what they're used to.
Well, I mean, I have thoughts on this.
Yeah.
Representation in its best form, which I would see as, I suppose not that dissimilar to how I would define diversity, you would have multiple people from different backgrounds represented at all levels and layers of an organization. And that organization would need to then have the culture to truly welcome those people in all in all of their authenticity, so that they can bring that to bear in whatever capacity. So in a government institution, that would look different in my view than what we have. I think what we have is people who have learnt that the only way to get ahead, the current cabinet, we're talking about the Tory party really at the moment, is to abandon and to denounce and to oppress other people who look like you. That's
Yeah.
the only way to get ahead.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you talk about us being monolithic and being able to be monolithic. I think one of the kind of retorts of the right is that, you know, left-wing people are oppressive almost. You're only allowed to have one viewpoint, right?
Yeah.
Like Kanye's whole thing when he went on that Trump rampage was like, black people need to stop telling me that I've got to vote Democrat. You know, it was like, stop telling me that I've got to vote one way. And it's like, but you're falling into the trap actually, because no, not everyone has to be monolithic, but actually the manipulation here is of the far right who are co-opting you in this moment to denounce the people who are your community and the people who got you to where you are, Kanye. And telling you to spout all of this rhetoric which is super harmful. And so there's this thing I think that happens and is happening. I mean, this is very fresh right now because as we're recording this, it's the week of the Tory party conference, and it's been an absolute shocker of disgusting, harmful, rhetoric. I mean, far right rhetoric, really. We're talking about fascist rhetoric coming from people with brown faces. And so how do you reconcile those things, and what does that tell us about those institutions that the most popular people at the moment, right? Suella came on to like Cheers and and I've seen Kemi, you know, in comments sections when I'm feeling up to it, being described as like a bright star of, you know, of the Conservative Party, an exciting new voice and whatever. What does it tell us about the kind of institutions of this country? That the only way to become successful is to be a child of immigrants who talks about the danger of immigration, the danger of multiculturalism, the hurricane of of people that are gonna, you know. I think it was Krishnan this week was talking to someone in the Tory party about that speech and talking about, you know, I've covered hurricanes. They're destructive. They're dangerous.
The connotations are wild.
They cause death. You know, what are we?
It's not the first time she's done
what language are we using here?
And I think that for me, that's when we talk about representation, that's an example. What we have in government at the moment is not an example of what I would say is balanced representation, right? Like it's a specific, like you said, the structure that is created to get to the top of that organization or the government. You have to assimilate. You have to be seen as almost like a white person with brown skin. You're almost like, I feel like they are almost weaponized. Conservative Party conference, talking about mass migration, talking about like the wind of change that carried like her parents across the globe in the 20th century was a mere gust compared to the hurricane that is coming. It's like
that's Rivers of Blood. That's a rehash of Enoch Powell, Rivers of Blood.
It's just so self-destructive, and the fact that
she doesn't believe it's self-destructive though, because she thinks, I assume, that she is part of the club. So it's like, I'm a member, I'm a bought and paid for member of this club, I'm in. And I think there's an interesting question of what this says about identity. You know, I remember when Trump was going for re-election and up against Biden, and I think that there were a few rappers who said that they were pro-Trump. A few black rappers. And my partner and I were talking about, well, how
does that happen?
How can you say that you're for this person who is? It's not even a debate whether or not this guy is a racist. He's outwardly fascist. And I think the interesting almost takeaway there was the realization that actually the reason they're going to bat for Trump is because they associate more with being a rich guy than a black guy. And so there's an identity question in there. I don't really associate myself with the black community anymore. I associate myself more with the rich white guys that I hang out with and play golf with and see at the club or whatever.
And there was the same thing happening with class, right? You had families that that lived a very similar, maybe culturally different, but in terms of economic situation, in terms of the things that they were facing every single day. You may have had some, two working class families, one black, one white, living next to each other, and you have, the white family feeling like they had more of a closer relationship to the things that Trump and that campaign was saying about like tax cuts. It's like, it's not going to affect you in a positive way. But
that's all the psychosis of whiteness, really.
Yeah.
It's almost like the great swindle that white supremacy is, which is to convince white people that their whiteness is what differentiates them. And therefore I may be poor and I may have nothing and I may be downtrodden, but at least I'm not black.
Yeah.
And if you can make people believe that that is something, then they'll protect it at all cost.
The thing is, it's the delusion of the things that you think you're going to benefit from are really more to do with class. And I think when you've got that happening at different levels as well, like you've got rich black rappers aligning to that, and then you have poor white people also aligning to that. It's like it doesn't even make any sense. The dots don't add up. Mm-hmm. It's actually just like you said. It's like psychosis, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Actually, I did a kind of training workshop recently-ish, a few months ago, about race and the history of race, and from the kind of transatlantic slave trade to modern Britain and that kind of thing. And all the things that I found most interesting in all of that in-depth research was this kind of realization of when whiteness was invented, and even the knowledge that it was invented, right? That it wasn't. It's easy to think of certain differences as just like, oh, it's obvious that I'm brown and this person's white, and that's probably just how we always categorized ourselves. And it's not how we always categorized ourselves. There's a very specific point in time when there's a creation of whiteness. It's enshrined in law for a very specific reason, and the reason is because there were slave rebellions, and there were African slaves and Irish white indentured servants who were basically kind of had the same lot on these plantations pretty much, and they were joining up and they were revolting together. In order to stop these revolts and in order to kind of differentiate, divide and conquer, classic move, there were these slave codes that were invented which officially said, black people are inherently different. They are destined to be slaves in perpetuity. If I have children, they are slaves, and so on until the end of time. And the only thing that you can use to differentiate is skin color. Yeah. And that's when it's created. Until that point, even in Christian Western Europe, people they didn't have the language to call themselves white. And then you see how white supremacy gets. It mutates and it changes over time. So the Holocaust is a weaponization of that same ideology, and obviously slavery and Jim Crow and all of those kinds of things. And it's just kind of mutated over time. And so now you see Suella and people like that who are similarly almost indoctrinated into this idea that I can get close to this holy grail, the top of the tree, if only I ingratiate myself, if only I denounce my brownness.
And the reality is, people are always going to see that. There's nothing you can do that's going to change that.
Yes, I mean, there's a weird. It seems like a weird mentality to me to think that if you purge, let's say you get your way, right? The Tories win the next election, you become the leader of the party, you're beholden to the far right, you enact loads of draconian anti-immigration policies, anti-LGBTQ plus policies, right? All of that comes into play.
Yeah.
They're not going to forget that you're a brown woman.
Yeah. And as soon as you do something wrong, perceive something wrong.
This historical precedent for this, we were just talking before we started recording of the leader of the Nazi SA who was shot in, I think, the night of the Long Knives, after the Nazis took power, because guess what? You can't be an out of the closet gay for very long in 1930s Nazi Germany,
You will not get the leniency.
regardless of the fact that you're friends with Hitler and he likes you quite a lot and you seemingly have quite a lot of power. It also makes me think of have you ever read The Handmaid's Tale?
I haven't read it, no.
So there's a character in it, who I guess is in the series as well, called Serena Joy, and she's a wife of a high-ranking official, basically, and they've obviously taken power in this Christian evangelical coup. And in the kind of lead up to this coup, she's a speaker, she's written a book, she goes on tour, and she's one of these anti-feminist women, right, who goes on tour and talks about how women have a certain place and you know. And ironically, what happens is when they take power and they get everything they want, she becomes heavily oppressed by the system that she campaigned for, right? And there's this irony that in the New World, women aren't allowed to read. And so she's not allowed to read the book that she wrote. You know, and so there's this like interesting thing of like, you have this platform because of feminism.
Yeah.
You are able to tour the country and speak and write books because of feminism.
Yeah.
And how ironic that you don't even see that that's what is affording you these freedoms.
Yeah.
And if you
I'm willing to
campaign,
acknowledge it.
yeah, and if you campaign for it to be taken away, it will be taken away from you.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. Yeah. You see that also. You see it in the workplace, right? If you're part of the underrepresented part of the workforce, you're going to be. I think people are more protective of themselves, but you do see people that like will stand by and watch shit go down and then think it will never happen to them, and then when it happens to them it's like they're so shocked by it. It's not not to the extreme of Suella, but sometimes I think like don't gloat in the fact that you're not the one that's being like, you can see the pattern here. It may most probably will happen to you at some point. You can stand by it, or you can just be like try and change it or leave. And like you just see some people that just like, kind of just steer clear of it. Like some places where I've left, people have come forward that I haven't even spoken to and was like, I'm so happy that you said.
Oh, that old classic.
I'm like, yeah. I'm like, oh, but you.
Thank you for speaking up.
Yeah. Like, but you
could have had my back there.
Yeah. you just sat there in silence, and it's like, you know,
we were all thinking it.
Yeah.
We were with you in spirit.
Like you could have sent a message. I remember there was something that you did when we were working together, and I sent you a message and was like,
"Oh, did I?"
Yeah.
A good thing.
A really good thing, but it was really difficult. You were dealing with an issue of how something was being.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about.
And I messaged you and was like, I am in awe of, I think something along those lines of like, you dealt with that in a way that I don't even know how you were able to do that in without losing your shit. And also you just did the amount of people of colour that would have been affected by that. And even just not people of colour, people that don't want to work in that environment of any background or colour, but specifically people of colour who are impacted directly. The amount of people that would have had to have just like seen that every day and was seeing it every day, and you tackling that and not having the majority openly on your side in that conversation, right?
The loudest voices in the room were definitely against me in that. I remember it. I mean, for reference, this was basically a kind of internal struggle that was unfortunately playing out on Slack during a lockdown. Something that I thought was quite innocuous that I asked the organisation to respect.
Yeah.
Because some people had said to me that they were finding, it was like the use of a specific emoji, basically, that they were finding it offensive. And it was complicated by the fact that the emoji in and of itself isn't necessarily offensive, but it is co-opted by the far right a lot. So there was a bit of nuance there, but, you know, I sent what I thought was a fairly innocuous message to just kind of request that people stopped using it, and it opened up a kind of free speech conversation around what the workplace is allowed to tell me what to do and what not to do, and there were some cultural differences between offices, and there was the added thing that it was lockdown and people were probably losing their minds a bit.
Yeah.
And it was just, and it was a kind of full day of responding to quite a lot of hostility.
Yeah. And I just remember, I don't think we'd even spoken before that point.
Maybe not. Maybe that was our introduction.
Yeah, introduction. I think I just joined. But yeah, the point I'm making is like, it does play out in the workplace. So like, you know, people will just stand by, and also they won't go when things are happening and someone is going forward and going, I'm tackling this, giving that person the strength as well, helping give them the strength by going, look, I've got your back. Like, what you're doing is the right thing. This is helping me. Like, and I'm sure it's helping a lot of other people.
So there's this question, I think, around representation of, is representation meaningful, and can it be meaningful if it's conditional on towing the party line? So it's almost like, you know, there was a tweet which a few months ago when there was a Tory party leadership race, and it was Rory Stewart who this is the tweet. So someone had posted a picture of some of the candidates that were in the race at the time. Lots of brown faces, basically. It was Suella, Nadeem Zahawi, Rishi Sunak, Priti Patel, and someone had posted this saying, the other day I was told that racism in 2022 is the same as it was in the 60s, just less crude. They can't be seeing the same things I see with this image of all of these people. And Rory Stewart had then reposted this saying, this won't make Twitter happy, but can you think of any party, let alone conservative from North America through Japan to Europe today, that would have such a diverse leadership list? Even if you don't like the individuals / Tories, doesn't it say something good about Britain?
Like, at the moment, I feel like with specifically the Conservative Party, but just in general, like, the types of politics that are being played at the moment are not genuine. And I think a lot of them doing those things of like putting all those people to the top is for exactly to make those kind of points, like for people to see that and be like, oh, we've changed loads. But actually the people, like you said, that they're putting to the top, and it's not creating any change in the party. They're still pushing the same rhetoric as when they weren't there. It's just that there's a brown face pushing it now.
Yes. And I think one could argue that makes it worse.
Is it worse?
Rather than better, because if you have a brown face of fascism, if you have a woman who says feminism's bollocks, and if you have a brown person saying multiculturalism has failed, and if you have, you know, it furthers it to your point, doesn't change anything for the better.
No.
And also it cements that as a legitimate viewpoint, because here you are, here's a woman saying it's not that bad. You know, we don't need feminism anymore or whatever. And you know, that becomes then a way of saying, see.
Yeah.
And also, look, she made it.
Yeah.
So
why can't you?
She made it, why can't you? But also there's no widespread institutional racism, for instance, isn't a thing because look at all these brown faces in the in the leadership race.
And actually, like we were saying before, representation needs to transcend all the way through that every level, right? I bet you're not seeing that level of representation. Like it's deliberately being bubbled to the top to give this image of that's what all the party looks like. But we all know, we're not stupid, that the party doesn't look that way. Like Labour doesn't even look that way.
I mean, Labour's got some real racism issues.
Yeah.
You know, you see the way that Diane Abbott is being treated.
Yeah.
And a lot of Muslim members of the Labour Party are being treated, and you know, absolutely not immune from some of these things. But it's kind of, we're going almost beyond a party politics thing as a question of like how institutions enable and promote success of a genuinely diverse groups, and what those people need to do to get ahead, and is all representation created equal? You know, I look at American politics in some way. You know, I know we're talking a lot about politics in this context, but I'm much more excited by a lot of American politicians in some ways.
Yeah.
Not just because of the increased, on the surface diversity, demographic diversity of AOC and people like Cori Bush and, some of the women in the squad. And I find them exciting because not only do we see diverse voices, but the diverse voices are saying something of note.
Yeah.
They're pushing an agenda that is interesting, that is new, that is fresh, that we haven't seen before. They're not brown faces pushing the regressive policies or doubling down on the way things have always been, pushing back against change. So I think there is a question with representation of, can it only be meaningful if it is pushing the agenda forward?
Yeah.
Otherwise, is it just tokenism?
Yeah. Solved.
Can just end it here, I think.
Like for me, like the Conservative Party example for me is complete tokenism.
Yeah.
And not in the way that I feel like not all tokenism is the same. It's a problem anyway. But like, there's tokenism of like, we've seen someone that has potential, so we're going to put them in this role, and we're going to scream and shout about it. But they're the beginning of change.
Yeah. And
then you've got tokenism where it's like, actually that person is so close to so close to us that it's comfortable for us to put that person in that role, and we're going to push that person to the front because we can trust them, because they represent, the only thing they represent that's different is that they have a different skin color, but they're still going to push all the same things that we want them to. So it's like a safe bet, and if it gets us a few more votes, then and allows us to be able to have the argument and say we're not racist. Boom.
Yeah, it enables us to say we're not racist.
Yeah.
So rather than us leaning into and looking deeply at our issues of racism, it enables us more effectively to paper over the gaps, because we couldn't possibly be racist if we have brown people in our midst.
Yeah,
we've let them have membership of the club. We didn't used to. Look at this, it's progress.
Didn't have to, did it?
But it's conditional. Put up and shut up.
Yeah. Put up and regurgitate.
Yeah, yeah.
And if anything, get away with what we can't get away with because we're white.
Yes, you can push it further.
Yeah.
You can push the anti-immigration rhetoric further than we can because you're a child of immigrants. So and actually, the cognitive dissonance of that is unbelievable.
Wild. Some of the things, like the insinuations in that conference speech, like, I'm just going to read some of the stuff here.
This is Suella's conference speech.
Yeah. Thanks to our new laws, the police can now get these clowns off our streets and get traffic moving in a matter of minutes. And that's talking about like Just Stop Oil protests and free speech. Mm-hmm. What other things does that?
I thought they were the party of free speech.
Exactly, you know what I mean? But it's
not protest though.
They're not protest. Yeah, not protest.
Not the free speech of protest.
Like, what are all the other we know that we've got to where we are as a society and as a country, and because of being able to do these things. There's a complete ignorance to that. Like that's not a big part of our history.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's an interesting vantage point that we use to look at history versus the present day. We're in the same week that Just Stop Oil were protesting at Les Mis, and people were which is an inspired move, really. And people were booing and trying to get off the stage, and the which they presumably knew would happen because they know the backlash they're going to get when they do stuff. But it's so funny to me that you're at a production of Les Mis, the ultimate protest musical, revolution, and can you hear the people sing? And then it's get off the stage.
Stop protesting.
Stop. We don't like protest when it's here in this moment. If it's not in the history books.
Yeah. It's so true. And then other things it's talking about crime as well, but it's why we've backed the police's use of stop and search as an effective way to get knives off our streets. It's not an effective way to get knives off the streets.
Who needs facts, Kieran?
Yeah, it's just
who needs stats and
who
data?
needs all those data-y things? But also things like
I actually read a fantastic article about this week
Yeah.
of like, you know, talking about how this is a party in government who doesn't know how to govern and only knows how to protest. So they're just kind of protesting themselves. They're like they're speaking and acting as though they're in opposition. They're talking about all these things that aren't working. Government's not working. Police isn't working. It's like,
they've been in power for like,
you
12
are
years?
the government. Yes.
You
know,
do realise that things are going wrong. You're talking about it as if it was somebody else. It's got worse under your leadership.
But it's a tale as old as time that then what happens is you've got nowhere to go but rock bottom, and let's just dredge up as much rock bottom stuff as we can. Let's find a scapegoat, trans people. Let's find another scapegoat, immigrants. Let's find another scapegoat, young black people. Let's align ourselves with, let's stir up some emotive identities, the police, you know, law and order.
Well, she talks about like foreign national offenders aren't clogging up our prisons and booting them out of Britain. Now, we know that a lot of people that are getting caught up in that are people that were from Windrush generation, that their parents didn't get citizenship because they didn't need it when they first came here, and now they are seen as not having a citizenship because they're a child of. They
were supposed to have indefinite leave to remain, but the Home Office got rid of all the documentation, and so now they're basically stateless.
They may have committed a crime, but let's not wrap this up in that it's someone that's come here, like, with the hurricane of immigrants that are coming to.
It's also worth noting that the Windrush migrants, so these people's parents, are not immigrants.
No.
They were told to come here because they were part of the British Empire and they had British passports. They are not immigrants. No. My grandma wasn't an immigrant. No. And I even slip into sometimes saying that and forgetting.
Yeah.
And she's like, no, we were told, and it was positioned to us as the mother country. Yeah. Come and help rebuild the mother country. Yeah. And we thought that because all the white people in Jamaica were all like landed gentry, we thought that we'd come to the UK and all the white people would be landed gentry. And then suddenly we were side by side in working class neighborhoods alongside white people who hated us and were telling us to go back home and calling us dirty. Imagine being told all of that stuff and coming here and it being cold and dirty and rainy and being called, you know, every name under the sun. And then now the indignity of 50 years later being told you have to go back or you can't get cancer treatment because this isn't your country. So, you know, when you've worked in the NHS the whole time or you've worked...
and we're like, obviously she's framing it as around criminals.
But this is also an interesting language of criminals. Rishi Sunak is a criminal. Boris Johnson is a criminal. Yeah. There's criminals and there's criminals.
Yeah. I hope that people, because there's more of these conversations happening, can really read between the lines of some of this, like, rhetoric, like, and some of the language that's being used. So one of the other things is like, there's much more to do to end the scandal of rapists and paedophiles changing the names to evade sanctions and criminal record checks.
Oh my God, did she say that?
That's about trans, right? That's basically what she's talking about.
Yes, that's what she's talking about.
And
that's
like,
vile.
What's this? What scandal is she talking about? In what numbers is this happening?
It's not.
And it just makes me fucking angry. It just makes me so angry because everything here, she's then talking about. Let me tell you something. I don't care if anyone thinks this is interfering with human rights. It's time to worry less about the rights of sexual predators and more about the rights of victims. And that's just after she said that last thing that I said. What's going on? Like, and this is all coming out of the mouth of a brown woman.
Brown people aren't monolithic. They're allowed to be evil, okay?
And that's true. They are. I mean, and there are evil people of all different colours.
I'm interested in your thoughts on, because what I find when working with organisations is there's kind of two ends of what feels sometimes like a binary spectrum that people can get into. Okay. On the one hand, it's easy to have tokenistic representation. Okay. It's easy to say we have women in our C-suite. Yeah. Without looking at whether or not the C-suite is still misogynistic. Culturally, you know, whether those women actually have a voice in that room and all of those kinds of things. So you can have this like tokenistic representation where people feel like, well, we've ticked that box, great. Yeah. There's no more work we need to do. On the other end, you sometimes get people say, well, we don't want to just have tokenistic representation. We want diversity of thought. And often that diversity of thought still looks like a room full of white people. And so how do you reconcile those two potential kind of potholes that you can fall into?
So first of all, I think it's true that you do need both of those things. I think you can achieve, if you really put the work in, the easiest way to get both of those things is to bring in diversity, not just of, you get diversity of thought by bringing in diversity just in general from my perspective.
Yeah.
Like if you bring, a queer black man and you make it an environment where that person can thrive, they're going to have a diversity of thought because they have a different lived experience. And I feel like you can hit more birds with less stones. I think it's problematic when it's being used, when that is being used like, well, actually we're focusing on diversity of thought first just to not deal with the trickier things around broader diversity. I think again it's just like it's approaching the easiest things first and then not committing to, it can be that thing of not committing to the harder things. And you see it sometimes in organizations where they'll commit to just having, I don't know, more women in leadership roles. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, what is the next step up of women that can be promoted into those roles look like? It's probably not going to be many black women.
Yeah.
I'm saying that as like in theory, like in
gender can be an interesting like representation cover up almost.
Yeah.
And by gender I mean I'm talking about cisgender women. Yeah. I'm not really talking about gender diversity from the perspective of non-binary and trans representation, because very few companies have much of that, certainly in leadership roles. But what a lot of companies do is say, well, we've really focused on gender and we've really focused on basically promoting white women.
Yeah.
and isn't that progress? And the way in which I think that can be really quite problematic, and why it really differs from certain other aspects of diversity, is gender doesn't intersect with class in the same way that race does.
Yeah.
So lots of white women are already pretty rich, already pretty privileged. They exist in households that are already, they can be born into money, they can be married into money, they can have a leg up in the same way that lots of white men have a leg up from a privilege and class and resources perspective.
Yeah.
That's quite different when we talk about ethnicity.
Yeah.
Very, very few people who are black in this country have inherited wealth, for instance. So it's a different dimension of diversity, and it intersects differently with the way that society is structured. And I think that it therefore is this kind of much more palatable, easier to talk about thing, because it's like, well, we can let women into the club. And really what we mean by that is women who are kind of already in the club. Mm-hmm. Women who are already going to the lunches and already, they've already been to the same schools and the same universities and they're already in the same social circles. They're fine, but they're already kind of in there already. And so it doesn't reflect meaningful change in the same way, social mobility or any of those things in the same way.
And I also think from a perspective of, and I can't speak from the perspective of, actually, I have close proximity to my nan, who is a white working class woman. It does that person an injustice as well, because I think actually, if you're a white working class woman, and I can't speak on that because I'm not a white working class woman, I think actually there'd be more shared lived experience with a person of color that's from a similar class, for example, and having that person within your ranks and being able to speak to that person in a way that you can connect differently to someone that hasn't grown up the same way. For me, I think that's also an injustice that way as well. It's like,
well, what a lot of the kind of rhetoric that we've been speaking about does and functions to do is to undermine class solidarity.
Yeah.
And it does that really quite successfully. You know, if you think about some of the movements, the political movements of, say, the 1960s, you know, did you know there was a White Panthers?
No.
There were Black Panthers, and
did I know that?
There were Black Panthers, obviously, who were setting up, you know, breakfast programs and all kinds of things for the Black community. And there was a group called the White Panthers who were in solidarity with the Black Panthers.
Yeah.
And they were like basically an allied group who recognized that they were fighting for many of the same things.
Yeah.
Fighting against racism, of course, but also fighting against, you know, fighting for unions, fighting for workers' rights. We could do better in many ways in the modern age.
Yeah.
Building kind of class solidarity in some of the movements that we've got.
Yeah.
Rather than the kind of, I mean, we've spoken a lot about allyship and how allyship can be hollow, but the sort of hollow, maybe almost magnanimous, charitable allyship that kind of pats you on the shoulder rather than stands in solidarity with you. And like to your point about white working class people, you know, I think there's many shared aims. Anti-racism is one of those aims, but there are many shared aims. I think understanding that actually so many of us in society are badly impacted by some of the oppression that we see, you know, I think that is a really galvanizing thing. Like if I think about trans rights and how I should get in the fight about that, I think it's more galvanizing to say trans people are fighting for bodily autonomy. They're fighting for the right to be who they are.
Yeah.
They're fighting for the right to live how they want to live. They're fighting for the right to be able to say, this is my identity and this is who I am, and who are you to tell me that I'm not that? Yeah. They're fighting for access to healthcare. All of those things matter to me personally as well. Bodily autonomy matters to me as a woman.
Human rights,
it's the same. We're in the same fight.
Yeah.
That's more galvanizing to me than to say, poor trans people, isn't it awful? Isn't it awful what's happening to them? Yeah. Do you know what I mean? There's two very different things energetically.
Yeah. It's more detached, right? It's like, what does that mean? Like, okay, it means that you acknowledge it, but you don't understand how it could how it could impact you and affect you.
Yeah, and I think all of these things affect us all. I think, I think white supremacy is horrific for black people, and it's horrific for white people.
Yeah,
it's horrific.
It's just objectively,
it's poisonous for everyone.
Yeah,
and I think the more we can recognize that stuff, the more effectively we fight this stuff.
Yeah.
And so endeth the sermon on that. I would like to talk to you a little bit, though, about representation in kind of popular culture and whether you think that it's a different thing. Viola Davis has said that great quote of, there's something about seeing someone who looks like you that makes it more tangible. You need to see a physical manifestation of your dream. I understand that, and when I look at what's on the telly now versus what was on the telly when I was growing up, so much of that is meaningful, I think, because I might have realised I was queer earlier.
Yeah.
I might have had more of a relationship with my blackness earlier.
Yeah.
I might have thought about some of the issues that I think about now in my formative years if I'd have had access to the same. I actually don't think it's just about the representation as in seeing more brown faces on the screen or whatever, or seeing more
topics,
black love stories, or seeing more queer love stories. I think it's more about the storytelling and the stories that you see now represented on screen.
Yes.
And at the same time, I understand the limits of focusing only on representation and the pitfalls that things like TV shows can fall into when they think only about representation.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question. I also agree. I think it's more about the stories I think there should be representation. So the way I first took your question is like, what's the difference between representation of like celebrities or pop culture and like, and I think that because there weren't any other stories being told other than the roles that they were playing, which weren't really telling stories. They were kind of co-stars, like people of color, or like there was never the center of the story. Whereas now
sidekicks.
They're sidekicks. So now we're getting much more richer stories. I think it's different. So before, when I was younger, I think there's a reason why so many young people of color wanted to be pop stars and wanted to be footballers and wanted to be, because that's where they saw people that looked like them, right? Like when I was younger, we were surrounded by sports people that were people of color that were winning. And that's the other thing, like at the top of their, seen as at the top of their game. I think the change now is great because you're seeing, it's more about the stories rather than, we're seeing much more diverse characters. We're seeing stories at every level from like Marvel, Black Panther, all the way down to kind of more independent films that tell different stories about different lives. I agree. I think if I was younger and had access to those types of things, I think it definitely would have made me think about things. And actually it would have made not just people, queer people or black people think about it. It would have made everyone be more exposed to it. And when I see people, like maybe like white people, white friends react to certain things that happened, like say in the 50s and 60s that I knew about because my family were involved in it, I think it really makes them reflect. And it's not that they feel guilty about it happening. They just didn't realize it happened. They're not taught about it. Like a lot of my friends have watched like Small Acts, for example. Like I know a lot of those stories. I didn't realize I knew them, and I was watching. I was like, "Oh, that's what Nan was talking about. That's what Granddad was talking about." Like, because it was never put into a film, like in that format.
Yeah, it was in your oral history almost.
Yeah, exactly. So I actually think we're further ahead in that sense than in a professional sense.
You know, you mentioned Black Panther, so I think there's an interesting correlation to be made between the two worlds in a way of you can see the difference with, for instance, Black Panther. I think then, you know, if you compare that to some storylines which I think have gone awry, and a couple of examples I would use there are Killing Eve, which I'll talk about in a second, and Last Tango in Halifax is another one, and something like Black Panther. I think that the big distinction between the two, and it kind of has a parallel in the working world, is Black Panther is quite clearly made, written, produced by black people.
Yeah.
So it doesn't just star black people.
Yeah.
And you can tell.
Yeah.
When you're, even if you didn't know, you can tell by the way the stories are told, by the costume design, by the way that the story that is chosen to be told. It's a story of black achievement. It's a story of black resilience. It's not a story of slavery. It's not a story of oppression. I can't remember exactly what the number is, but it's something like of all of the black women who've ever won an Oscar, the highest percentage is for playing maids. Right, it's like the story that the establishment wants you to tell. The white establishment often wants you to tell.
That resonates with.
That resonates. It gets you the Oscar, man. Is often one of oppression and of servitude, and you can tell the distinction with Black Panther. That's why it feels so revelatory. It feels so much like something you've never seen before.
Yeah,
and
it's
that's
the same
because
with Miss Marvel, which is a Pakistan main character, central character, but it was all created by people that are from either Pakistani or South Asian descent, and you can really tell the richness, the way that they deal with being a teenager that has such strong cultural value, and the things that she and the history of her family and the challenges that she has being a teenager in Western American society, but being born in America, she's like I think first or second generation. And all of that can only be really told if there's people that have a close
understand that experience,
understand it, and you can really tell it.
And so I would say that's an example of almost what we're talking about when we talk about representation and diversity from top to bottom. Yeah, you know, there was controversy with Killing Eve, for instance. Firstly, there was controversy because at one point there was like a kind of Zoom screenshot that they took of the writers like having rapped, and it was an all white writing team. partly that's significant because essentially the main character is an Asian American woman, and she's written as quite an annoying character, to be honest.
Oh, really?
And I always kind of found that quite problematic, and it was interesting to find out that there was an all-white writing team. I don't know whether that was the case all the way through the seasons or not. It's also a notoriously terrible ending, and you've not seen it, so so I'm not going to do a spoiler, but it's a really terrible ending from a gay character's perspective, and it falls into some really bad tropes. And again, you can feel, I think there was a queer woman in the writer's room, and I think there was a little bit of controversy where she said she didn't agree with the ending, but she was the only one in the room, and there was a little bit of drama around it. Yeah. But it's a bad ending.
Yeah. And can you feel the clunkiness of it?
And it falls into, and you can tell it wasn't written. Queer people were not in the room writing this. Yeah. Similarly, in Last Tango in Halifax, I can't give the spoilers away. Written by Sally Wainwright, who's fantastic. I love her, and she wrote Happy Valley and a load of great. I also love her because she's Yorkshire. She writes things in Yorkshire, but it falls into a similar trope, a similar, it writes that, you get excited. It writes these gay characters, and it basically puts obstacles in their way. Because gay people can never be happy, right? Gay people are never allowed to live happily ever after. And it's interesting how there are these such widely known tropes in the gay community of like how gay characters get written by straight people, and straight people seem completely oblivious to these, and they fall into them every single time. And it's like, how are you falling into writing this same storyline again and again, where you sabotage this gay relationship because there's some deep rooted bias there where it's like, this person couldn't possibly end up staying, this woman couldn't end up being in a relationship with another woman and just be happy and that be the ending. You gotta sabotage it in some way. And it's so clear, those kinds of stark differences, when it's not just gay characters on the screen or gay actors, but also it's gay producers and writers and directors. Yeah.
And actually, I think you can probably relate it similar to like that speech, like this, so whatever, Braverman, essentially written by a cast of writers, for example, like that are not like they're talking about something that they're.
I'm like, did she? I think she wrote that herself.
But it was greenlit by it would have had to go on past like her advice, all that kind of shit, right? Like, and I just think there's that thing of, and you can really feel it, and you can tell it's because it's not got people in the writing room that have lived experience.
I mean, I think she's also a special case in a way because she's completely deranged.
It's true.
She's completely deranged, and she's deeply racist. And I think for you to be a very deeply racist person of colour, you've got some unresolved trauma that you need to work out without psychoanalyzing too much. Like the self-hatred is strong. You have to have a lot of deep self-hatred to behave in this way and to have so much hatred for people who come from similar circumstances to you and your parents.
Yeah, that's true.
That's deeply deranged.
Yeah. And I think going back to like what you were saying about, so we've started watching American Horror Story, and I think there's been some controversy in the last one, right? And I think, or the last couple, but I'm on season.
Are you watching it in order?
3, Coven.
Oh, that's the best season.
Yeah, and I was fully expecting, as soon as they introduced the voodoo element, I was like, oh god, here we go. I was like, this is going to be full of fucking stereotypes, and like, but I actually felt like it was really well written. It was like the right balance. The voodoo witches weren't seen as like the bad. Like the history was like really rich. I mean, I think for me, it was a bit too much of like showing black people getting tortured, and like when they went back into time with that woman that had that horrible house, but it just felt like there was a lot of that. And it was like some.
Oh, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, especially towards the middle of the season. It's like, we get.
She was real though, you know that.
Was that based on a real person?
That's a real woman.
Jesus Christ. But and they were like, some of it I was like, oh god, this is a lot. But maybe that was
like
just
trauma porn.
But I think that's the same with some of like the way gay characters are written, black characters, sometimes are very like one-dimensional. I think you're seeing less of it now.
It's more obvious now because there are more stories.
Yeah.
I think, you know, if you think back to the 90s,
Yeah.
you think about Brookside had a lesbian storyline. It was like, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And it was
What
like,
was the
doesn't
Hollyoaks one,
matter
McQueen's?
if it's shit. Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas now you can kind of, you know, the beauty of having more is you expect more, and you say, well, should this storyline have ended in this way, or should there have been not? We want more. We don't just want a gay storyline, which is 2 straight actors and no queer people in the writers' room. We want representation that is more full-bodied almost than that.
And we want queer people that aren't just this like one type of queer person, which may be more flamboyant.
You know, I don't know if you ever watched Queer as Folk in the 90s.
Yeah.
I definitely
probably shouldn't have been watching it.
Oh, 100%. I watched that with my mum when I was, I don't know, 10. And again, you can tell that that's written by a gay guy.
Yeah.
You can tell that's the experiences of a gay person. That's also why it was kind of revolutionary.
Yeah. And even the new stuff. What's the name of the director and creator?
Russell T Davies.
Russell T Davies. The is it Banana Cucumber and
and he also did It's a Sin.
It's a Sin, which I haven't seen yet.
Oh, come on, Kieran.
I know it's bad. I need to see it. Partner's seen it. Like, you have to watch it.
Yeah, you've got to see it.
I really need to see it.
I don't think representation is meaningful if it's entrenching the existing status quo.
Yeah.
So, you know, in history, if that's black slave drivers working for white plantation owners, that's not black progress.
No.
That like promotion level isn't black progress at all.
Playing a role within that structure.
And your role with to entrench that structure and to cement it further.
Yeah.
I think that's meaningless representation.
Yeah.
I think the real rich representation.
Sounds very ungrateful to me. I'm joking.
That's a promotion.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be grateful. I think the meaningful representation that goes beyond the kind of tokenism and the demographic tick box is, are we actually transforming anything? Are we changing systems? Are we changing the stories we tell? Are we expanding beyond stereotypes? Do brown people in this organization have power? Do they have power behind the scenes?
Power.
Do women have power to speak up in this whether that's on a TV show, in a government institution, in a corporate environment? You know, I think that's the real question. And I think that actually it's really ignorant to try and hoodwink us into thinking that seeing a load of brown faces pushing far right talking points is any kind of progress. Yeah.
I find it offensive. I just think if you think that people are that, I mean, maybe some people are.
Yeah, it's stupid. It's like
stupid.
It's insulting that we would fall for it.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it's the distribution of power is a big thing. We live in a society that is all about power, though. But if we're going to balance that out, we have to meaningfully redistribute some of that power. If we're going to have real representation, it's being okay with distributing that power. So I think there needs, for there to be real representation, there needs to be power behind it. I think representation is challenging. It's really hard. It forces people to really think about, you know, what they represent, what they're willing to compromise. And I think that it's really important that we think about the deeper damage that we might be doing by having this kind of like surface level representation.
Okay. Thanks for listening.
And